and thank you for joining us today to learn how business interruption coverage may be able to help offset some financial losses incurred due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I am Juliana Stanley, Director of Member Experience and Practice Solutions with the Arizona Medical Association. Joining us to present the webinar, Maximize Practice Potential in 2021 and Beyond, Evaluate and Offset Practice Losses in an Age of Governmental Funding and Business Interruption Insurance. We have Danielle Lawler, a CPA with Second Draw Loans, Archie Lamb Jr. of Counsel with Levin, Pampantonio, Thomas, Mitchell, Rafferty, and Proctor, and Matthew Katz, Principal with MCK Health Strategies. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has taken a toll on all of us, and many of our physician practices are struggling financially. I find it interesting that many business owners may have coverage under their business insurance policies that could help them offset financial losses that are sustained as a result of the pandemic. Would you please explain how your team's service can help members of the Arizona Medical Association? We'll begin with Danielle Lawler, who is a certified public accountant working with medical practices. Danielle will review the PPP program and guide us through those complexities. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you, Juliana.
All right. Okay.
So we'll start with who is eligible for a payroll protection program second draw loan. You will have to have received a first draw loan. That's important. If you have not received a first draw loan, you can go back and receive one now. You have to have been in operation on February 15th, 2020, and not permanently closed subsequent to that date. You can be an independent contractor, self-employed, sole proprietor with employees, businesses with no more than 300 employees, and some other fancy things that don't apply to medical practices. Who is not eligible? Businesses that received a shuttered venue operator grant from the SBA, publicly traded companies, and business entities created or organized in China or Hong Kong, and lobbyists and people affiliated with the government. To calculate the loan amount, if you use the same exact payroll and expenses that you use for the first loan, you can just go through the same bank, use the same costs. It's gross wages, sick time, vacation, severance, anything that you've paid someone to work for you. The employer portion of health insurance costs, the employer portion of retirement plan benefits, state unemployment taxes, and you can use 2020 if that yields a better result for you, but most people will have a better result under 2019. Loan documentation for loans less than 150,000. You don't have to supply as much documentation applying for the loan. So you can go in there, you don't have to prove the downturn in economic events. You don't have to prove that until you go for forgiveness. If you're over 150,000, you will have to provide that documentation at time of application. And they'll want to see 2019 and 2020 and the calculation showing that. So what costs does the PPP program support? Payroll costs, gross payroll, severance, sick time, vacation, health insurance, retirement plans, state unemployment taxes. And just note that you cannot use the same payroll costs for the PPP program as you use for other credits, and that's important to note as they have changed the rules for the employer retention credit. So you want to be cognizant of that going forward. So let's see, other costs that they may be eligible for. They've expanded the costs to software and cloud computing, things that you need to get your business back up and running in this period of COVID. Also, you can include rent, mortgage interest, utility bills, electricity, gas, water, covered operations and expenditures. If you suffered property damage due to vandalism or looting or related to public disturbances not covered by insurance, those will be covered as well. Covered supplier costs, those are basically costs that you already had in place with suppliers that you regularly use in your business. For covered worker protection expenditures, plexiglass, help, the masks, the thermometers to take the temperature, anything that you use for check-in for your employees, all of those things can be used for the PPP program. So what if you didn't get a loan? Of course, earlier I said you can go and get one now. And once those funds are expended, you can apply for a second draw loan, and it's open until March 31st, 2021. Loan forgiveness, again, on the other end, is at least 60% of the forgiveness will be for payroll costs, but you can use 100% on payroll. But with this whole balancing with the payroll credits and the PPP, you just want to make sure that you're utilizing both of them to your benefit. So that is something to keep an eye on. Documentation. They require a lot of documentation. So they're going to want bank statements, third-party payroll provider reports, quarterly tax filings. A lot of them are asking for state unemployment, federal and state unemployment tax filings, canceled checks and account statements for insurance, and also the calculations for retirement plans and those things. For non-payroll costs, they want to see that. So if it's a mortgage, they want to see an amortization schedule. They want to see that it was in place before February 15th. For rent or leases, they want to see that they were put in place before February 15th, 2020, and they want to see receipts or canceled checks. For utility payments, they're going to want to see an invoice from a period that covers February 15th, 2020, and the current periods as well. And for operations expenditures, again, same thing, copies of invoices, purchase orders, all of those those things. For property damage, so just documentation, and it, you know, anything that you can get, if it was due to public disturbances, anything that you can get to support that claim. For supplier costs, obviously you have contracts with your suppliers, you can use those. For worker protection expenditures, you can show receipts if you had to order plexiglass or anything else. So I think that about covers it, and I believe that you are going to be handed off to Archie.
Thank you, Danielle, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys about business interruption insurance coverage. You know, this is all a new world to all of us beginning in March of 2020, and the business insurance, business coverage insurance falls under property and casualty coverage. You'll have a general liability policy, and then your business owner's policy will generally be the place at which your business interruption coverage is found. One of the things that you heard about early in this pandemic is just how the insurance industry was incapable of handling the losses, and that the insurance companies were at risk for bankruptcy and insolvency. I want to point in this particular slide to you the fact that that is just simply not the case. In 2018, for example, the close to 6,000 insurance companies in the United States netted 1.22 trillion in premiums. Property and casualty, which is what we're talking about in this instance, was over $618 billion of revenue. And more importantly, in 2018, of the $618 billion in revenue, the claims paid were only a little short of $50 billion. So there's a lot of things going on, but one thing that is not going on is the insurance industry is not at risk over these policies. So what are the policies? These commercial property policies are known as all risk policies. In other words, unless there is a specific exclusion or something specifically omitted from coverage, you got to assume, or the insurance carriers got to assume that there is indeed coverage. In fact, you actually spend additional premiums to obtain business interruption coverage. And we've talked about the fact that it's a business income coverage, which provides compensation resulting from a covered peril. That's very important language. And as we analyze insurance contracts, it's very important to look at the specific language, because in contract construction law, the scrivener, that is the author of the policy, is to the extent there is an ambiguity or something vague about the coverage of the policy, it always goes in favor of the insurer. It's really important to look that that's the perspective that one must come from when you're evaluating whether or not you have coverage under specific language of a policy. The whole issue of is there an exclusion that applies is something that comes up all the time. And if you've ever been through a hurricane or a tornado or a flood or any of those things, you will find that if there's coverage for wind, the insurance company wants to call the damage as a result of flood. If there's coverage for flood, they want to claim the damage as a result of wind. And you get into a catch-22, if you will, because in the final analysis, they're looking to find no coverage. And that may sound cynical and skeptical, and maybe I'm a bit jaded after 32 years of practicing law, but that's simply my experience, that to the extent they can find a way to get out of paying the policy coverage, they will. The virus exclusion is really an interesting piece, and we'll talk a little bit later about regulatory estoppel relative to that. But one of the things we've learned is there are probably 30 to 35% of the policies written do not have a virus exclusion, and we'll come to that in the next couple of slides. And here is the virus exclusion. We will not pay for loss or damage caused by or resulting from any virus, bacterium, or other microorganism that induces or is capable of inducing physical distress, illness, or disease. Now, this language or language similar to it is found in many of the policies that you have. And so there are arguments to be made. For example, claiming that a virus is a microorganism is contrary to the reality of what a virus is. So that is an inconsistency that we are attacking as we attempt to get the court to understand that there is indeed coverage, which brings me to another question. Whether or not a policy covers your peril is a matter for the judge. In other words, the court makes the decision, and that's why you'll see, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, the issues of motion to dismiss are all decided by the court. And again, I'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. So what is a loss? It really and truly is anything that is proximately caused by the actual event that in this particular case, the pandemic, the virus itself is the causative factor, and anything related to that, and Matt's going to address this a little bit later, whether it's lost revenue, additional expenses, it does not need to be, you don't have to have tornado damage to find coverage. And the courts have found in many situations where just the presence of contaminated soil or ammonia or carbon monoxide, other invisible and noxious fumes can be a physical loss, even though you can't see them, but you can smell them. And in this particular instance, the insurance industry has en masse decided to fight coverage for viruses, for the virus itself and the damages that hospitals and other healthcare providers, medical practices have experienced as a result of the hazards related to the pandemic. I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but back in 2006, when the industry was proposing this virus exclusion that I read to you earlier, they misrepresented to the regulators who were in New York who were attempting to apply it as to how it would affect coverage. And so that is a major issue that we are taking on your behalf. And while I'm at this point, let me say that what our firm does, and there are a lot of other firms out there that will do this, is we don't charge you by the hour to review your policy. What we will do is if we do find that you have coverage, we'll help you file the claim and expect to get paid at the conclusion of the case when you get paid. So it's not doesn't cost anything to find out if you do indeed have coverage. And in fact, the first thing you really want to do is get that policy to an attorney that practices in this area to see if you have a virus exclusion. It's a far different analysis if you don't have a virus exclusion than the fight that you get into if indeed there is a virus exclusion in the policy. So here's a little bit about the reality of sort of the world in which we live. On your beat, let's assume hypothetically that you have a policy that doesn't have a virus exclusion. You hire us and we file your lawsuit. The first thing that happens is the insurance company is going to file a motion to dismiss. And in our experience, they usually file motions to dismiss in the cases that they have the best argument, or in the state that's got law that is more favorable to finding no coverage. And so what happened in the early stages of the litigation in March, April, May, and June, there were a lot of negative decisions because the insurance industry is the one that got to choose which court those fights were in. And the courts that would be more favorable for the insured, they didn't file the motion to dismiss. So it was held in abeyance to some extent. And even now we have numerous decisions around the country that say the virus exclusion applies and there is no coverage. There are arguments about the words loss of or damage to, quote unquote. And so it's loss of use or damage to. And the disjunctive or means that loss of is different than damage to. The industry is trying to argue that they're the same. The event is the same. And so, look, the reality is we're fighting that. Sometimes we win that, sometimes we don't. But it's a fight that's really essential because, as all of us know, the staggering damages and the shuttering of medical practices is a reality that we're dealing with. It was exactly caused by the threat of the virus or the virus itself actually being on the property. And that is the type of interruption to your business, to your professional ability to earn revenue that should be covered under that policy of insurance. That's why you bought it. And so it's a huge issue and a major fight. And there are lots of other firms around the country besides ours that's fighting this fight on behalf of physicians. And I've represented doctors for over 20 years throughout the United States in litigation against the payers of in the insurance industry relative to downcoding and bundling of CPT codes and medical necessity and all those things. So I tell you, I have a little bit more of a personal bad attitude when the people who are chosen to lead and fight for and care for the citizens of our country as a result of the pandemic are being told that, yeah, you need to take care of them, but we're not going to cover that indispensable service that you render. So anyway, that's one of the reasons it's such a righteous fight, in my opinion, to find coverage and fight for you guys to find coverage in this situation. So again, I think it's critical that the first thing you do is get somebody to help you find out if you've got a virus exclusion or not. Surely in the grants and other monies that Danielle was describing, you've had to go through and look at the economics. And again, it's not only is it lost revenue, but let's say, for example, you were going to open a new facility with 3 more physicians in the middle of 21, and because of the pandemic, you couldn't do that. So you got the building sitting there, but no doctors, no patients, no revenue. That budgeted lost revenue is as important to count as the fact that you went from 100 patients a day to 30 or whatever the case may be. So really important, and Matt's going to address some of this later. But not only do you have those losses, but you're also going to have additional expenses. And Danielle was talking to before we got started. We're talking to Juliana, and expenditures for plexiglass and masks, the additional PPE. All of these costs and expenses are recoverable under the finding of indeed a covered peril under the policy. The last thing here before we go to the next slide, Juliana, please don't take the word of the broker or the insurance adjuster who's telling you, oh, there's nothing to see here. That's bad. That's not good. Don't do that. I've already covered the fact that it's lost revenue. I think Matt is going to address some of these relative to the bad debt and some of those other areas, because he's worked in the area of management of physician practices. So I'm not going to get into that. Matt will talk about that on his in his section. I just mentioned PPE, just saying that again. And of course, so many other new things in the marketplace, in the practice that you've got to deal with. I mean, telemedicine is something that is really on everybody's mind. I think, that's one of the true byproducts of the pandemic, is the transfer to telemedicine and remote treatment to the extent one can engage in that. It's all expensive, it requires training. It's a software and technology related issue that's expensive. And all of those things are coverable under the theory that we have under the business interruption coverage under the as a result of the pandemic. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend, Mr. Katz, to share with you his thoughts and experience in the actual practice of medicine and the costs associated with that, and how to help you build your claim as broadly as possible, and how the interface of the federal and other grants impact your overall claim. And I'll just turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Archie, and thank you, Danielle and Juliana. So real quickly, just to highlight what I'm going to go over, we're going to talk a little bit about the lost revenue, talk about state funding and grants. Then we're going to get into the medical expenses, the equipment, the implantables, the health information, and other miscellaneous items, some of which Danielle and Archie have touched upon. I'm going to go into some greater detail so you have an understanding of how to build your claim if you in fact do have loss. Just to put things in perspective, some recent studies have shown that just in New York, the hospitals in New York lost $20 to $25 billion. And through all of the federal programs, they've only gained $9 billion. So there's still a significant loss. The American Hospital Association has said that hospitals have lost close to $325 billion and have only been offset by about $70 billion in federal funding. So it is important to recognize that you are getting PPP money and you are getting PRF and other grant money, but you still have a loss, or most of you still have a loss. Nationwide, 40% of Americans are still delaying care. According to data from August, physician visits were still down almost 10%, where they were down almost 60% in March. So we are still seeing that negative trend compared to last year and compared to 2019. And even though telemedicine, as Archie mentioned, is a new thing and has taken off, it is still a very small percentage of the overall visits. But it's a very expensive component because you have to prepare for it, buy the equipment, the technology, and train. Next slide, please. So again, we've got different approaches for funding that you might have taken advantage of: the PPP, advanced payments from CMS, state agencies, health insurers. There's some HRSA funding, some substance abuse SAMHSA funding. Almost all of you got some provider relief funding. There's some federal communication, FCC telemedicine funding, and for very few, but some, there's federal emergency management funding as well. Paycheck protection, we're going to skip over this because Danielle talked about it, but talk about a little bit about the other funding that's available. There was over $100 billion in Medicare advance or accelerated payments available, but people who took those and then started having to pay loans, that loan money is actually an expense that's attributable to COVID. So it's important to recognize, and some of these had high interests as well. So it's the interest provision as well as any payment you have to pay back. When they did an advance payment, they weren't giving you free money. It was your money from the future. So you are still out money. And it's important to recognize that. Congress did try to do some things. They did change the interest in the loan from 10.25 to 4%. They did that in October, but 4% is still a very high percent for a loan. If you have to pay back money to the government and they're taking it out of your payments that they're supposed to be making to you. Next slide. The Trump administration, towards the end of 2020, did release another $20 billion in provider relief funding. Physicians were able to start applying for that on October 5th, 2020. So there were 3 total rounds of funding through the Provider Relief Fund. Some practices received 1, some received all 3. Phase 3, just a little bit more. I'm not going to go into detail on this slide. There's a lot there. Just recognize that if you receive greater than $10,000 and there is a higher degree of reporting than if you receive less. If you receive 500,000 or more, there's even a higher degree, and 750,000 or more, there's a higher degree and even some audit potential. The Consolidated Appropriations Act that was passed in December 21st gave another, as I mentioned, $3 billion for provider relief to ensure that providers had additional funding. It clarified some definitions of loss and also provided some additional flexibility for physicians when it comes to being eligible. The IRS and the Department of Health and Human Services have made a number of determinations as to what's taxable and what's not. As you can surely imagine, most of this becomes taxable. So now let's talk a little bit about lost revenue in your practice. There's a number of ways of looking at lost revenue. There's a 3-year rolling average. So you can look in 2020 at 2020, 2019, 2018. What is that rolling average and how far off are you in 2020? You can compare directly 2020 to 2019, whether it's the first 2 quarters and then estimate the last quarters if you're not finished or if you're looking at all of it. And you have to think about whether you were in full operation that whole time. Then the third approach is to compare 2020 to what you budgeted. And as Archie said, if you were going to open up a surgical center, if you were going to open up another practice site, you bought the real estate, you built out, but you didn't hire anyone, all those expenses should be considered. Bad debt, has it increased, decreased, stayed the same? Are you seeing a higher degree of bad debt? Most physicians are. That has to be considered. Were there new service areas delayed or canceled? Were you going to buy that CT and you didn't, but you had it budgeted for it? Did you have to furlough employees? Did you terminate employees? Was there any expense tied to the termination, payouts, additional continuation of insurance for them? Any disability or workers' compensation also comes into play and can be counted as an expense tied to COVID-19. In addition, as I believe both Danielle and Archie talked about, the personal protective equipment. Everyone thinks a mask is inexpensive, but when you look at having to wear a mask with every patient and every day, it really significantly adds up. All of those additional supplies and costs are additional medical expenses that in fact you would not have incurred, if it was not for COVID. The facility barriers, the plexiglass, any additional walls, any signs or notices that you had to have printed up, any parking lot updates, new paint, special lines, any tents. A lot of people were putting tents up at the beginning of 2020 for patients, so they weren't inside yet because they didn't have the social distancing set up. Any labor costs, this is important. It's not just the furniture you bought or the equipment you bought, but it's the labor cost to bring it to you, to set it up, to fix it, any additional beds or exam room items, any air filtration systems, heating, cooling, anything you had to put into your building or practice because you had to adjust for COVID, either the social distancing, state or federal requirements, or simply to accommodate your patients so they would come back, is something that can be seen as a practice expense and attributable to COVID-19. In addition, there's some new medical equipment for some practices to comply with CDC or other guidelines. There's also equipment you may have held back in replacing, but you then had additional maintenance expenses. You wouldn't believe how many practices had to buy carts for their computers because they didn't have carts before in order to do telemedicine. As Archie said, telemedicine is a rather inexpensive way of providing care, but it is expensive to set up. You've got the hardware, the software, and the training. Do not forget the training of your clinical staff and your administrative staff, especially as how it ties into billing and how it ties into everything else in your practice. And all the equipment rental is important too to consider. Some of you that provide implantables within your practices or medications, or you dispense as a pharmacy, or you do testing and equipment and supplies, you probably have a lot of things you bought in advance that you couldn't use that either went bad or you still haven't been able to use. Those are expenses. You bought them in advance, you couldn't use them. They are things that you can identify as an expense tied to COVID. If things went up in price substantially and weren't covered by your insurers, your commercial insurers or Medicare, but you had to buy them and you had to either provide them to patients or use them in your office, that differential of cost is also something that you need to keep track of and recognize as an expense related to COVID. And I mentioned health insurance. I mentioned before telemedicine, but there's a broader category called health information technology. And that's everything from billing software to remote patient monitoring to health information exchanges, all of them EMRs, all requiring additional software, additional hardware, assistance from vendors outsourced, people coming to the practice, the training, the purchase, even additional expenses tied to insurance, cybersecurity you didn't need before, but now that you're doing telemedicine, you need it. Well, that's an added expense, again, in order to provide telemedicine to keep your practice open. It's important to recognize all those. Some other miscellaneous items tied to practice cost. Advertising, telling the community you're back open. Working from home expenses. Did you buy your staff cell phones, new cell phones? Did you pay for their mileage? Did you pay for Zoom accounts? Did you pay for conference calls? Did you provide Wi-Fi for them or did they have to pay for it? Fax machines, copy, printers, routers, everything you need for your home, not just your home as the physician, but also your admin staff. Any additional security costs? Any additional medical liability costs? Did you close your practice and were there costs to closing it and then costs to opening it? Did you have to remodel your office in any way or repair or replace anything such as countertops that may have been damaged because, again, you experienced COVID-19? So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for listening to us. And we tried to map out the PPP program, some of the other federal programs, what is business interruption, why, in fact, you should be looking at your insurance contracts because you likely have it, and then determining whether or not you have a valid claim and how important that is. And you don't want to have a missed opportunity that a year from now, someone says, you lost $500,000 and you had a policy and could have received that money back because you've been paying your premium for the last 25 years. So we are here to help. And I don't know if there are any other questions that we might be able to answer. Juliana, you're on mute.
The mantra of 2021. We do have some questions that we'd like to talk about. And,
Sure.
And first of all, I'd like to thank you all for your participation today and for pointing out those expenses that, some of us don't really think about as being COVID related, obviously PPE because we didn't have to use it before, but training expenses. We're always training. We're always getting new software. We're always doing this. We're always doing that. But this has been increased exponentially. So it's important, I think, to go through that long list and tick every box because those little things all add up so quickly. So one of the questions that we had is if a physician wants to present a claim, do they have to do an audit or be audited to be able to file a claim for business interruption coverage?
I can start with that, and then I think Archie can kind of go into that legal aspect of that next step. The initial answer is no. You are providing. Again, the first thing to do is to make sure your policy has that coverage, and then retain an attorney to assist you. But then you need to go through and closely evaluate and review your budget, your books, what you spent, what you lost. But you're not being audited at that point. You're just collecting the information to provide an accurate depiction of what transpired in your practice for the claim you are filing. Archie, I don't know if you want to say
No,
anything.
that's right. Yeah, there's no requirement to audit. Obviously, you want to have your numbers solid and all encompassing, because you only get one shot at saying, here's my whole damage. And so it is important to count everything that you lost and everything you had to spend that you wouldn't have otherwise had to.
Great. So once we've got all our ducks in a row, we know what the number is, we go to file a claim. Are we going to hope that it just flies through the first time? Or are we going to say, you know what, realistically, it might get paid, it might get denied. Chances are pretty good there's going to be something in that that's not going to be paid fully. What does this process look like?
Yeah. So the first thing you do, you definitely need to kind of have an idea about what the damages total is. Okay. But setting that aside, your initial claim is this medical practice and these places makes a claim under their, whatever the business owner's insurance, policy number X at this company for any and all losses and expenses covered under that policy. That's the initial claim. And then they'll come back with questions. So there's a process of exchange of information. But you do want to, as you just said, Juliana, you want to have your ducks in a row. You before you actually, as soon as you reasonably can. And I would think by now, I mean, we're 10 months into this thing. So by now you have a pretty good handle on revenue lost. You're probably, I hope you're back to some high percentage of original revenue. And you probably have a pretty good handle on the expenses that you will incur. Most policies have a 12-month period. So you got 12 months is your claim. And so it's not something that you do over and over and over and over again.
So does that mean from March of 2020 to March of 2021, or it can be any 12 months along that timeline?
It will be from the moment that the claim arose. Okay. The moment that you knew or should have known that the virus was on the premises, or someone had gotten sick, or somebody nearby had shut down a community. So you had to do the same thing by a civil authority, the government shut down. Some triggering incident would have started the claim period. And it's 12 months from that moment. So
then that brings me to the next thing. The three of you can help the Arizona Medical Association members by walking them through this claim process, through getting those numbers together, but you do so much more. I know that you can help them to take care of the details on the front end, but then you're going to be there to support them through the whole process. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Matt.
Sure. So one of the things we do, and one of the things I do for practices, is to make sure they haven't forgot anything. So we really go toothpick by toothpick, because as Archie said, you get one shot at that first number, and oftentimes it goes down from that first number, right? This is a back and forth, and so you want to make sure you have the best first number, most accurate first number. So I'll go back and forth with that practice, asking questions, some of like what you've asked, Juliana, or you've seen in the presentation today, but in even more detail on specifics tied to their medical practice. If they're a cardiologist, I may be talking about implantables such as, the pacemaker leads, and issues of how long they've been on the shelf and do they have to return them, and how many are those, and the frequency. Or if it's an orthopedic practice, have they bought knees and hips in advance, or are they buying them as they use them, and the expense there. So we go through that level of detail. Once we've got that, it's handed over to Archie to look at from a legal perspective. If they come back and say, well, this isn't included, that isn't included, that's what his role is, to guide the practice from the legal perspective. Mine is to get it ready for that claim initially, and then obviously look what the insurer comes back with and says what isn't accurate, and then I help with that process too. But Archie is that legal assistance, that national knowledge that knows when they say something, he knows what they really mean, or if they try to deny something, he explains why it is tied to the policy.
Okay.
And also Juliana, Anna, who is here in that lovely photograph, is an attorney also working with Matt and I and able as a team to answer questions, just so you know.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we have, and I think that's the important thing too, Juliana. It's sometimes it's a simple question that starts the whole process with a practice, and it may start the whole process over again because they forgot some things. So simply reaching out to us with a question is okay, because we know that's probably going to generate a lot more questions and a lot more engagement. But that question, that initial question is the key. Make sure to ask it.
Okay. And I know a lot of our practices applied for the PPP loans to begin with. And Danielle, you covered a lot of information quickly through those slides that identifies, you know, what the PPP loan is, what's includable, what's not includable. Let's say that that PPP loan was received. It was used to offset those allowed expenses, but there's money there that now they're going to claim for, because that's money they wouldn't have had to borrow, right? Am I getting that right?
Right. So a lot of practices, they seem to think they have extra money left over, but you don't. You've used that money to pay payroll in place of what you didn't make during that time period. You've used that money to pay for your utilities and your rent and just keep the doors open. So it's important to not look at this as like some windfall or anything. It's not a windfall. You were
Not a grant.
actually, right, you were actually protecting your business during that time. And just because you've come out on the other side of it looking a little bit, you know, brighter, doesn't mean that you're not going to qualify for full forgiveness. You need to look at all your costs and expenses and take full advantage of them.
Okay. So if
And
the loan is forgiven, or portions of the loan are forgiven, then that's obviously not going to be part of the insurance claim. But if you have the business interruption coverage and the PPP loan wasn't fully forgiven, there's extra expenses there, can they claim that through the insurance company?
If there are extra expenses that it hadn't covered, absolutely. The interest is also recoverable. Again, if it ended up becoming a loan and not forgiven. The other thing that's important to recognize is when they filed for the PPP, they may have filed for the third and fourth quarter, but we're now in the first quarter of 2021. So there's still expenses ongoing that they haven't filed for. So they may have covered expenses for March, April, May, June, July, August, but they're still not up at 100%. And so every month that they're not at 100% compared to whether it's budgeted, the 3-row rolling average, or compared to last year, they still have a loss. And
I see. So that's where that starting point
is so critical. And so,
okay.
you know, and then you may have to, if you're filing a claim, you still may have to estimate, for example, what your loss is going to be next month because you still have claim time, right? But if you're only at 80%, you're probably not going to be at 100% next month. You may be at 85, but you still have loss.
Okay. Thank you. Just checking to see what other questions that we have that we wanted to make sure to cover. Now we talked about, you know, the fees that are clearly associated with the additional expenses we had for COVID. But what about the billing company, the IT company that we have to pay for their service to get us set up to build these extra things?
Yeah, all the expenses that you would not have otherwise incurred to improve, enhance, streamline, make more efficient your operation. Perfect example is telemedicine technology and the software and all of those, the training that everyone has to go through. All those are clearly compensable expenses under the claim.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of practices have done 2 or even 3 rounds of training because, you know, we had to stand it up so quickly. It was kind of like a free-for-all. Okay, what can we set up fast? Yep. Okay, this is okay, but we need to do more. So now we've done this. This is a little bit better. and this is not a long-term solution. So now we're going to actually fully implement this into our EHR and get everything working together. So it stages even of those expenses.
It's not only stages, but people forget how expensive it is to train staff.
Oh,
And not just the clinical staff, but the administrative staff. And you hit on something very important, connecting it to your EMR. Most people probably went out and got the quickest, cheapest approach to begin with that had no bells and whistles and also no way of downloading anything into their EMR. So they were then spending time, which is money, having someone, retype, transcribe all that information into the EMR. Well, those
Right.
transcription costs you wouldn't have had otherwise are additional costs.
Right.
Now then you buy an EMR or you buy a telemedicine that's connected to your EMR, but then there's interoperability or connectivity fees that can run anywhere between $500 and $5,000 per practice site that you're paying for. So those things have to be considered. Then there's the outside IT time, the technical help and support. You needed new equipment, you needed new computers. It doesn't work with the new stuff that you are going to use. You have to pay for that. You need a home computer. That's included too. Because again, you wouldn't have had any of this. We were probably 10 years away from where we are today when it comes to where telemedicine is. So that's a good thing for telemedicine, but it's a bad thing in many ways for medical practices because they had to spend what they would have spent in 10 years in a few months. And so it's important to recognize that and capture all of that.
Right. And then, there's the added temporary employees that we had to plug in because we had staff who were out sick or who had to stay home with their children because there was no daycare, there was no school, there was nowhere for them to go, and no way to work remotely if you're a medical assistant who normally checks in patients and takes vitals. So there's a lot of staffing expenses that, seems obvious on the surface, but then as we dig into the different layers and kind of peel the onion back, we find that there's more there.
And some practices let go of staff, and actually it may have been more expensive to let them go temporarily and then hire them back because a lot of practices continued to pay for their health insurance because they didn't know how long this was going to last. Plus they had new people or additional people they were hiring, workers' comp. They changed policies. So instead of not having time off in advance, they were giving time off in advance, but that was a payroll expense. So all those payroll expenses, it's amazing how many practices hired security for making sure people were in line appropriately or in facilities the right way. So additional security they hired. I know one practice that cleaned their facility every day that was doing it before once a week. So their cleaning costs went up almost 7 times because it was a daily activity versus a weekly. And I don't mean the regular cleaning. I mean the deep cleaning that you bring someone in to do. They were doing every day. And those really add up.
They certainly do. Well, I thank you so much for presenting these materials and for talking with our members and for taking care of Arizona physicians. We really appreciate it. The slides will be made available to everyone who's watching the presentation. And we're all available for questions for anyone who needs help. Thank you all very much for your participation.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Y'all be safe.
You
Be
too.
safe out there.
be
Thank
safe
you.
and ask questions, and we're here for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.